Freddie, thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's such a pleasure to be talking about something that's so close to my heart. And that was just such an interesting discussion. I knew this question was going to be asked, but I still found myself saying things that I didn't expect, and I hope that you did too. And I heard Tony say, "Oh, that's probably the most interesting bit of the evening." So we're going to try and give you even more interesting bits of the evening than that with this fantastic panel that we're going to have this chat with, and there will be a good 20 minutes for you to ask questions at the end as well. So please do be listening and engaging and thinking of what you want to know from these very magnificent people. You've had the biographies. I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but it's an immense pleasure, first of all, to welcome Tony Juniper. Tony and I go back a while. We've done various things on telly and various other events, including one just last year. And so Tony is chair of Natural England. Before that, he headed advocacy for the WWF UK. He's done so many things. He's an absolute icon in the nature field. I'm sure you all know that. But I do very much commend to you his many brilliant books, including one of my favourites, Rainforest, which I happened to brush past on my shelf, very well-worn copy as I was coming out tonight. And also, What Has Nature Ever Done for Us, which is very relevant to the topic tonight. And maybe we need to be asking, what have we ever done for nature? So Tony, thanks very much and welcome. And then we have Harry Bowell, who is the Director of Land and Nature at the National Trust. He was previously at the RSPB, responsible for nature reserves across the country, some incredibly cool and beautiful places, lucky you. And of course, the National Trust is our host for tonight, along with the Conduit Club. And then we have Deiza Gadji, who's a youth climate justice activist. She was, get this, I love this so much, she was the youngest candidate for the European Parliament ever. And what did she stand under? She stood under climate and ecological emergency independent. I would certainly have voted for you, and hopefully you'll get in next time. And was also a founding member of the XR Youth Branch. So welcome very much to all three of you. It's really brilliant to have you here, and it's brilliant to be engaging in this conversation, which is, can the UK save nature? And I'm going to launch straight into this initial question about, first of all, we have this question, can the UK save nature? So there's a lot of organisations out there. There's Natural England, there's the National Trust, there's plenty of other organisations that are actually actively trying to do this and have been doing it for a long time. I should quickly mention that I gave a quick bio for the others, but not for me. I realised I've been working on climate change now for 30 years this year. In academia, in media, in politics, in business. Lately, I've been doing most of my work on trying to reverse climate change by looking at carbon removals, and of course nature plays a very big part in that. But in all of that, it's easy to look at it and say, well, we're doing this earlier in the green room, to say, so many people have been working on this so long, and where has it got us, and what do we need to change? So first of all, what's happening now? What kind of interventions are working? What more do we need to do? Anybody? What interventions are working? What interventions are not working? What more do we need to do? Interventions.
Okay. So what I think is beginning to work is more partnership working between farmers, NGOs, official agencies like Natural England, scientists. That is beginning to yield some dividends. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, what is also working is the demanding radical activism that's coming in quite an uncompromising way, as Extinction Rebellion has been doing. And sometimes, I think there's a tendency to think it's alternatives. In fact, we were discussing this just a moment ago, weren't we, about environmentalists often having it's an either-or kind of approach to solutions, when in fact, I think if you look at what is working, i.e. partnerships at one end, and on the other end, really demanding direct action, both of those are working quite well. And in the middle sits everything else, including public opinion, political choices, what the media is reporting. And so I think we're making progress. I mean, the challenge is how quickly we're making progress, and it's not quick enough.
Tell me about some of the, because in principle that you say that the push from either end is kind of working. There's many other things that could go into there, including, for example, government action and so on. But specifically, what kind of interventions do you think are really making progress now? What's happening that you think is good?
Bigger scale. So on nature recovery in particular. So trying to halt and reverse a decline of the natural world, we have to get scale. So little tiny pocket parks of nature simply are not enough. We need more, bigger better connected areas of wild nature. And people are beginning to do that. And Harry and I were just talking about a piece of work that the National Trust are doing in Cambridgeshire, which is a really good example of this, where a little nature reserve that was established literally 120 years ago, a few hectares of remaining fenland habitat, is now, I think, about 4 square kilometres, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's growing, and this is exactly what we have to do, especially to be able to deal with the resilience in the face of climate change issues, because little tiny populations of animals and plants hanging on in little tiny tennis court-sized spots, it's not sufficient.
Sure.
So we have to get scale, and we are beginning to do that, and that's a good example. Maybe you picked that story up, Harry.
I'll add a couple of things if I may. So I'll come back to the scale question, but my old boss at RSPB, Graham Wynne, used to talk about total war. And what Tony's just said is sort of chimed with that, which is it's obvious that one thing is not going to do it, and that we need a really collective and wide approach to how we think about the problem, rather than a kind of reductive series of things that we need to do. And just on the question of scale, it's an obvious thing that nature needs land. And one of the trust's contributions, and there are many other landowners that need to step up to it. One of the trust's contributions as the largest private landowner in the UK is to think about our own landholding and then act in scale both on our own landholding, but in concert with others. And there are many places where we are really beginning to do that with bells and whistles on. Wickham Fen, just outside Cambridgeshire, is one of those. But we are constrained there by our landholding. There are other places where actually our landholding is really big, but we've still got a load of nature headroom.
I'm going to check in on Wickham Fen. I had a really amazing experience there, very, very early one spring morning. I was very grumpy about it. I was making a radio program about nature and climate change, and it required going to listen to the dawn chorus, the spring dawn chorus, one of the absolute wonders of the world.
Pretty early.
But for Wickham Fen and whenever it was, late April, it really meant a sort of 3:30 in the morning after staying in some skanky bed and breakfast, no breakfast, no coffee, nothing, just stumbling out of bed, discovering it was pouring with rain, getting in the car, going along there, grumpily walking along in the pouring rain, in the dark, hungry, and then the birds started singing.
Data's given us an alternative approach, which is to give us a mojito and push through to dawn. And then I think
probably would have been better just to stay up all night. But I do remember that, and the blackbirds and the cuckoos and all of the warblers and so on. And I will never forget the contrast with the feeling of just to being lifted up into the sky from Wickham Fen, so thank you very much. But I want to pin you down to something specific. When you say lots of things are working, it's good to get scale, it's good to approach a large landholding, but approach it and do what?
So I'll give you a couple of examples of
Sure.
the kind of thing we're up to. So we know that, for example, there's a huge relationship between decline in nature and the quality of our water bodies, in particular our rivers and our lakes. So one of the things that we're doing, again in concert with others, is really thinking about how we restore rivers, not just for nature, but also to give people access to them. So one place which springs to mind, a place called Honeycutt Estate down in Somerset, behind us actually in this picture. We're doing, which we love a label, we're doing stage 0 river restoration. Mm-hmm. The first one in the UK where we're taking a total river and allowing it to completely reimagine itself. So stopping up all the historic drainage and then allowing the drainage pattern to re-emerge. You then put beavers on top of that, and boy, have you got some really interesting large-scale results. So that's one thing in one biggish place, but that's the kind of activity that we need to be doing more of. And there's a whole load of benefits that stem from that, not just about nature, but about downstream flooding, about carbon captured in the wetter peaty soils, etc., etc.
Well, so it's a wonderfully romantic way to describe it, allowing a river to reimagine itself. And I'm going to come back to that because that seems like it's quite an important clue for how we actually help nature help itself. But just sticking with the question of scale for a moment, I can absolutely imagine largest landowner in the UK, fantastic, so we can scale approaches, but it still has to be, it's like one thing here, one thing there, different local approaches. So how do you actually marry those two? How do you how do you roll out to get enough scale in your restoration at the same time as making sure it's locally appropriate? Either of you. Yeah, please.
Just give you a sentence on that. So there is a policy that the government adopted a few years ago. So we at Natural England, we are the government's delivery body on the natural environment in England. And so we're working very closely with people who are writing policy and setting targets. There was a thing that was in the 25-year environment plan in 2018, which said we will build a nature recovery network, right? So this is not something you hear very much about, but it is really the template that we're now working with to try and decide what habitat is missing in which part of the country. It might be more grassland in Wiltshire, more woodland in Cambridgeshire, more wetlands in Kent, more heathland in Surrey. It's not as simple as that. But however, the point being that it's kind of locally about the context, but trying to lift that up into a national picture that can start to turn the corner. So that's kind of the planning framework, if you will. There's a lot of complexity to it. And like the government piece is kind of a top-down kind of view, but we've got bottom-up processes, which is the partnership stuff and the kind of thing that National Trust is doing alongside many others to try and meet the national goal through action on the ground. But it varies from place to place. I mean, this is the difference with climate change. A ton of carbon here is the same as a ton of carbon in Leeds. Whereas the nature recovery, it's completely different, almost field by field. Yeah. Which makes it more challenging.
Sure, and I think...
do you mind if I just add one thing? Sorry, I'm very
add away. We'll get to... Jason's going to have plenty of time to talk. Do not worry about that.
I'll shut up after this for a moment, which is...
What we do is we let the men speak and then we skewer them, right?
Quite right. And we'll come back to this, I think, later. But we're really interested in the mutuality of finding a way that we can make our thing other people's thing. And I'll just give you one example. So we're working across a landscape with Yorkshire Water. Yorkshire Water, they're kind of interested in nature, but what they're really interested in is water supply for their customers in Leeds and Bradford. But they own a load of land, which abuts National Trust land. So we're in tandem with them. We've seconded some staff into their team. They're doing some really interesting work about modern restoration, but what their driver is clean water, and they've realised that actually it's cheaper to do that than do it in a water treatment work. So there's something about the harnessing the power of others to this task, not just thinking that we can do it all ourselves. And we'll probably talk about that in a bit.
We will come back to that because it is an interesting, it's how marrying what leverage we can harvest. But I'm going to come to you now, Dace, for a couple of questions. One is the same thing, which is what do you think is working? But also, is it enough? It's obviously not enough. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the reason I've been so quiet is because I'm the worst for this, but I don't think about the tangible. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to face something that we've never faced before. Right. So it's about how do we basically influence the culture. And me and Tony were talking about this before. A lot of my work is focusing on how do we get people to connect back to land. So we know that people can learn how to love the land, therefore know how to be in communion with it in order to not harm it. And that's like the roots. And like if we kind of start to look at those roots of how did we get into this mess, what is it manifested as, and then sort it out from there, all of the actions in itself will be from the intent of this really deep loving care for the natural world. So that's why I kind of focus on the nature connection bit, because I take the climate crisis right back to the enclosures of this land, and this kind of real level of disconnect from people and the land and access to land. And this is why I think it's really important, like the National Trust, opening up spaces. But then also there is the conversation around partnerships. How do we get local communities to feel empowered in being the service providers for these spaces? How do we make sure that they feel like they have skin in the game as well?
Well, let's go with that, because there's a lot in there to unpick, and I'll unpick them all. But let's start with that one, because when we were talking about how do you get scale, but how do you act locally, it was kind of NGOs or possibly the government trying to do a top-down, connect together the picture. But obviously, and this it is, what a ton of CO2 in London is the same as a ton of CO2 in Leeds, but you need to have different kind of local action. But it's still as true for climate change as it is for nature, that it's essential for people to have agency. And so what does it take to get that, to harness that? What's stopping it? And how does a sense of justice come into that? Not just a sense of what makes this effective, but how can we bring the whole issue of equity and justice into this?
So that's 4 books you've just invented right there. I'll try and give you a soundbite version as I see it. And again, this is a conversation we were having a moment ago, Days and Harry and I upstairs. And part of the trouble is, in connecting with people, is that we're trying to connect at quite the wrong level. And so if you listen to the news or look at the arguments going on Twitter and various other places, you see there is a discussion around, well, should we do wind power or should we do fracking? Should we do electric vehicles or should we do more efficient petrol cars? And that is interesting, but it's facts and figures at a very kind of superficial level, because the thing that's underpinning that conversation is political choices and what the country has voted for and what the politicians have got a mandate for. And beneath that is an economic piece, which is about the fact that we're all signed up to economic growth. And then beneath that is a cultural piece, because we're all consumers and we like cheap stuff and we like to have a new car and everything else. And then beneath the cultural piece is a philosophical piece, and that's the real basement. And the philosophical piece is about our place in the world, how we relate to the cosmos, our relationship with nature. And for the majority of people in our country, it simply no longer exists. There is no relationship with the land. So think about land, our most obvious connection with that is food. Most people's food now is in a plastic bag or out of a freezer. They've got absolutely no sense of the soil or the ecosystem, never mind the farmers that produced it. We're utterly divorced. And so fixing that philosophical disconnection and realizing that we are as much in the natural world as bumblebees and daffodils and blackbirds is a really, really important task. Hard, but it's one that we neglect as our attention is constantly drawn back to these arguments about fossil fuels versus renewables, should we do the recycling or not, all this stuff. So I think it's fundamental, and the conversation needs to kind of get down to that more fundamental space. Not easy to do, and sometimes it's not even a conversation, it's more about experience.
Exactly.
So how do you do it?
Yeah, there's something in this of where you spoke about whether we're doing enough. And one thing that really scares me is that we'll focus too much on the top-heavy stuff, the carbon capture technology, but then we won't address this philosophical question of who are we in this larger ecosystem, and that will just lead to, whether it's a climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis, it will lead to other crises. What we have to do is really have to do the inner work. We have to ask ourselves the questions of how are we contributing to this toxic system.
I hear you. Harry.
Yeah, I was just going to add 2 things to it. One is it's kind of something for the trust and the sector to probably get out of the need to think about Victorian self-betterment when people come and visit places. And the trust gets 250 million visits to outdoor places, and we find it quite difficult to leave them alone and just connect. And so something in that about really allowing people to feel a connection to nature. And then the second thing, just a great joy of being in Birmingham. It was literally,
I never thought I'd hear that phrase.
Things don't go, you Londoners. I had the great joy of being in Birmingham with my team a couple of weeks ago, where Birmingham City Council, we're working with Birmingham City Council around some work they've done spawned from COVID and people's response to needing to have nature in their lives during COVID. They're really focusing basically the city strategy and how the city sees itself around the question of environmental justice, and in particular the connection in everyday life to nature. So they've mapped, and it's no coincidence of course, that they've mapped the areas of grossest deprivation in Birmingham against connection or connectivity, and it's absolute correlation.
Meaning there's less ability to connect to nature in the places with most deprivation.
Completely. So it kind of follows that if you're thinking about the future progress of the city and the well-being of the people, that we have to think about nature connectivity in people's lives. And there's a clamour for it, and COVID showed us that.
That's super interesting. So I was about to say that as a challenge. It all sounds very nice to say, and believe me, I'm a very big fan of doing the inner work and doing that kind of interconnection. But we can all sit here and say, so what needs to happen is people need to, and I, that even that kind of more enlightened approach, it's not working fast enough, and so it needs to be very focused, directed interventions. What do we actually do? How do we put the pressure in the right places? How do organisations like yours, like the National Trust, like Natural England, actually intervene to help make that happen?
I feel like, could I come in here? Because, you're going to love this. But I am going to admit to something.
Am I really?
Oh, you're going to love this. So I'm a big fan of trespassing. That is something that I like to do, and I like to encourage people
You're
to
a big fan of?
Trespassing.
Trespassing,
Yes,
okay.
Hampstead Heath is one of my favourites. But the thing is, it's about recognising where people are. And I think what we need to realise is that it's not that people don't want to or they don't have the time to, but it's they feel like they don't have access, they feel like they don't have belonging, especially when you start to do the connection with class, with ethnicity, and with like this deeper level disconnect. I'm a first generation immigrant. I felt for a very long time that I did not belong to this land. And when the politics is telling you the same thing, you don't go out searching for the Lake Districts and the beauty of the soil, So I think there is something in allowing people to be able to connect there every day where they are. And I work at a nature reserve in East London of where we do that. And because we know it's open and we say this is a space for us to be with nature and this is a space for us to be part of nature, what would you like to do with it? And the programming does itself. Yeah. So I think it definitely is about how do we get people feeling empowered, but then also how do we give them access to land so they can feel like they can connect.
Sure. Okay. So I'd like in a bit to come back to that, to what that actually looks like for all of us and for the future. But let's go back to some of the more kind of big picture practical parts. And I promise you we will come back to this. It's very interesting. But just to unpick some of the other things that you were saying. So we're saying, how can we protect nature in England? And I have a very brilliant cousin who works as a ranger in the South Downs, and I've been to visit her a few times, and she's taken me around and she's shown me how they're deliberately trying to take up invasive species, and they're deliberately trying to encourage others, and it's a very noble enterprise, and it's a very lovely job, if you like that kind of thing, which I personally do. But it feels a bit like what you were talking about, Tony, which is having a small patch here, or kind of, not putting a thumb in a dike so much as kind of trying to hold up a tsunami with your hand. Yeah. So what direct interventions in nature, like the one you described of the river and the beavers, can we actually do to really give nature a chance specifically?
So there's a lot of things. So one thing that is important in this, in terms of the finger in the dike point, is how the conversation has recently changed over about the last 5 years, where we've gone from talking about protection and conservation, which remain essential, but now much more we're using the phrase nature recovery. And so this is actually quite a profound shift, because one implies and was all about hanging on to last little remnants that remain, whereas now we're talking about how we get recovery at scale. And you need a different toolkit. And so the toolkit that we used to operate as a government regulator was to draw lines on maps and make various things either illegal or restricted inside that space. If we're going to do nature recovery at scale, that won't work, because we have to deal with all the people outside the line on the map who own land as farmers, the water companies that Harry mentioned, house builders, infrastructure providers, NGOs, all of the different actors who are in the landscape have to buy in to the idea of nature recovery, which makes this much less about regulation and much more about hearts and minds, and being able to find spaces where people can come together and to start to agree that actually, yes, we agree, we should have more birds, we should have more woodlands, we should have cleaner rivers. And that's a sociological thing rather than an ecological thing. And so it's kind of more about skills of engaging people than it is ecologists telling you how rare the spider is that was recently found there. So that's the difference, and that's the journey we're on at Natural England, trying to foster more of that. And the policy is kind of adding up increasingly, but it just takes so long.
Yeah. So tell me, let's just stop on that for a moment. So Natural England have been doing that. So you talked about the Nature Recovery Network, which is actually trying to put this. And Natural England actually hosted a summit for that this year, didn't they? So what happened there? What worked? What energy was there? What changed?
Well, it's very positive, I have to say. So we I mean, all these phrases and they get very complicated. During the course of this last period, when we've been thinking about Nature Recovery Network, we have built a partnership of 650 organisations now. And so some of them you'd expect, like National Trust, RSPB, Wildlife Trusts, but we've got the Church of England, we've got National Grid, we've got KPMG, and, you know, Barratt Homes, and these kinds of organisations who are coming in to this discussion that didn't exist before about how could an organisation like National Grid or National Highways, what can they do to help nature recovery? And the answer is an awful lot. So 1% of England, would you believe, is road verges? So how about we stop spraying chemicals on road verges and mowing them to within an inch of their life every week? Would we get more wildflowers? Yes, we would. Would we finish up with more insects? Yes. That would mean more bats and birds, wouldn't it? And also it would save a shed load of money at a time when we're trying to cut back on expenditure in various areas. So bringing that partnership together and creating the opportunity for people to see their own reasons for doing it. As Harry said, you know, the water company, yes, they'd like to have more birds, but actually this also goes part and parcel with the water being more secure to supply to the customer and it being cheaper to put into the network.
So there is an economic part of that too, and I want to come to that. But first, still in this kind of unusual allies, unusual alliances, unusual partnerships, because that, you know, KPMG and the Church of England and Barratt Homes, say what now? But it seems like when you're describing, don't just put a ring around a small area and say we'll dictate what happens in there, but actually make it much wider. It obviously needs to entrain more kinds of people. So is this your experience? I mean, Days, Harry, what about very unusual kinds of alliances, people that you never really thought you might be allying with?
Oh yeah, so I do a lot of consultancy around nature connection work, and I just took up a client, Bupa International, and I think they're particularly quite strange. I never thought I would do consultancy for a healthcare company, but it's the idea that they've just had a new CEO, and what they've done is they've actually extended their mission statement to not just focus on health, but to focus on making the world a better place, and their work is now encompassing everything. And I think seeing, like, you know, KPMG and many others in the corporate field kind of take ownership over, like, the responsibility that they have, and then moving forward and saying we're going to do things differently is really important, especially when they're upholding a lot of the carbon emissions that we're facing today.
So can you imagine Extinction Rebellion going to partnership with any of those?
I think activist groups, a lot of the time, they hold a different space, and I think that's like the recognition. It's about how do you work almost like in like tandem together, but maybe not together.
I mean, in a way, Tony was talking about this before. He sort of said, on the one hand, you've got you've got this group, and on the other hand, you've got the activists, and in the middle, everyone gets herded in and says, oh, well, we better do something then, right?
Exactly, and I think groups like Extinction Rebellion are definitely the push, slightly annoying sister that's always trying to make you do better. And we need to kind of see it in that way. This is a movement ecology, and that's what we traditionally call it, about what parts do we play, and then we're expecting other people to play their parts too.
So you clearly met my sister.
I love that. I've got a really annoying sister.
Harry.
So yeah, just two examples, and both of those, both of them, I think, strike at something I'm really interested in. The first is with Nestle. I think it's probably the most unlikely partner the trust is working with. And again, it comes back to what are their drivers? So, well, they happen to own and need a really secure supply chain for their food processing places, including clean water of a quantity. And so we're working with them in the Peak District and elsewhere, where they are coming up with a scheme to pay our tenant farmers for outcomes, which is kind of interesting. And then the second, and I still think is one of the most inspiring things I've seen happen in the UK ever, is the RSPB project at Wallasey Island, where a bit of genius found that Crossrail, as it was, or the Elizabeth line as it's now known, required a secure place to put the spoil, the removals from the tunnel. And they did a deal with RSPB to effectively create a nature reserve in the Blackwater estuary. And that was a really interesting, that was 100 million quid that the RSPB would never have been able to dream about, but actually is an amazing win-win. I'm told as a Sheffield person that the Elizabeth line is a functioning train system, which we don't know anything about. But that's a different story.
But it is really interesting, isn't it? That certainly in my work in climate change, quite often I'm often going and talking to investors and businessmen. I'm saying, look, this is why it's in your financial interest. This is how you can get a lower cost of credit. Blah 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 blah. But what I often find, even in some of the businesses that you think are the most kind of farthest away from this kind of I care about nature, they're delighted and relieved to kind of have air cover. If they've got an argument that they can make to their chief financial officer, then they're delighted and happy that they can then say, we want to do this, but we just need the economic case made for us. But our hearts are in it as well as our heads. I'm surprised how much I find that.
Well, believe it or not, institutions are made up of individuals, aren't
Yeah,
they?
they're made up of people, more astonishingly still.
But and joking aside, we often forget that, and we in our sector can sometimes be really preachy and not realising actually there's a human being that actually might really care about this stuff, but they're doing a job for all the reasons we do.
And they need to be supported by people in our sector who have the knowledge, who have the experience to be able to do what is pretty hard shit.
Sure. And I think, that combination of holding their feet to the fire, but actually giving them, I often use this beautifully mixed metaphor. We need to hold their feet to the fire, but not paint them into a corner, right? And my English teacher would have been horrified, but it does work, kind of. So I want to move on to climate now, because we've talked about some quite direct interventions, but we could do that and try and protect nature directly and within the UK. But there's ways in which the global situation affects the UK in terms of the global biodiversity crisis, migratory birds, etc. And I know that COP15, the biodiversity COP's coming up just next week. So and then there's also on top of that there's the climate crisis. We could. But there were people who were worrying about the wetlands and whether we could actually do in the Severn Estuary, whether we could actually put a tidal energy system there, and they were saying, but it might affect local wildlife. And I was trying to say, you don't seem to have realised how bad climate change is for all wildlife. And so, what about the intersection? We're trying to get away from either or to a both and. But what's the intersection here with this global picture of global biodiversity crisis and global climate crisis?
Do you mind if I go?
Go.
Is that right? So I think we're increasingly wanting to tie the two things together. The solution to climate is at least partly and in large part bound up with land use. So the biggest single global threat to nature currently is not climate change, it's land use. Pollution second, climate change coming up fast. But in terms of extinction globally, the biggest driver is land use. And if I come again sort of in an insular way to the trust owner state, our biggest emitter is land use currently. But also we do know that if we think about nature and nature's recovery, actually we think there's a complete symbiosis there. The second thing I'd say is that a lot of, it's an obvious thing to say, but unlike paintings in our houses, the nature in our places is fluid, and a lot of things migrate. So we can have the best possible stewardship and care for, Arctic terns on the farm islands, but they spend more than half of their life in the southern oceans. So unless we think beyond the UK, not just in terms of nature recovery, but also in terms of climate impacts, then we're frankly, we can answer no to the exam question of tonight.
What do you think, Dace?
Yeah, I think it's, at least to me, I feel like it's pretty obvious that we have to look at it holistically. The ecosystem doesn't work in categories. That's just not the case. So we have to look at the situation holistically, and we have to remember that we live on a planet with around 8 planetary boundaries. These are all things that need to be respected, and we need to learn how to live within them, and we need to figure out what part do we play to contribute to that. So it's this recognition that they have to be seen as connected. Also, the suffering of people and like class issues, racial issues, all of them are interconnected, and the only way we can really solve this is by addressing everything.
How much of your work is on climate?
How much of my work is on climate? I say all of it and none of it. Yeah, I feel like my work is, weirdly enough, climate and environment is the route for people to know who they need to be in the world and how they need to show up. And that can manifest itself in many different ways.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. Thank you. Tony?
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with what Days is saying around this need for a holistic perspective, because there's 8 planetary boundaries, climate, biodiversity loss, water, land degradation. They're all connected to one another. Ozone depletion, chemical radiation.
Smart. No one likes smart. No one likes a smart.
We can do all 8 if needed, but the point is that they are all fundamentally connected to one another, and yet in policy making they're all separate, as your question is inviting, Gabrielle. The other thing, of course, is that not only are all of those ecological boundaries connected to one another fundamentally, but there is also a fundamental set of connections into the social dimension. It is a linked social ecological system that we have to manage, and we've fragmented the environmental bit, and we've also fragmented the social piece, and this is where we need to do some really quite serious work to come with that holistic and integrated view. And it's really hard in Western societies because everything is put into little categories where you have a kind of, you know, a policy, a budget, a line of data, and some objectives that are set, very often disconnected from objectives that are closely related and which should be contributing in the same direction, but are going off at best at a tangent and sometimes in direct opposition. And so, you know, this is a tough one. And it takes me back to the point made a moment ago about the need to get down to that basement philosophical level and to understand that this is a deep shift that's needed. You can't do it with going electric with this car and, you know, putting your plastic into the bin. It's much, much more than that. But it is something which is a mindset piece. Actually, you know, there's another dimension to this, which I've come across over the years. People, well, it's human nature, isn't it? We all want more stuff and we all want to consume more. Surely there's nothing you can do about this. This is a great demonstration of exactly the problem, because if you go to the Amazon and meet the indigenous people there, who are human beings like us with brains like ours, they take an utterly different view, because they've got a very different philosophy based upon them dwelling in a natural system, which is their life support system, and they can feel it and they can breathe it and they live it, and the destruction of the forest to them is a completely mad idea. It's only when the Westerners turn up and say there's some wood there and there is some minerals under there and we can clear this place and grow cattle instead. This is a completely different worldview. And so going to the worldview and trying to find ways in which we can begin to make some impact on that seems to me to be a top priority, but it's darned hard work in terms of where to start.
So
but I think some of this
you,
challenge that comes from the activists is a good place to begin.
And I think there's something about like knowing history as well. So I talked a bit about the enclosures, but you know, we're living in England, where we've got these beautiful Celtic traditions that are so based in loving the land and being connected with nature. So we don't even need to go as far as Amazon. We can learn about the Druids. We can learn about the people who lived here before and take many lessons from them in order to influence the way we act today.
Sure. Well, I'm going to go in a few minutes. I'm going to come to all of you, so be ready. But before I do, I'm going to indulge in my own position as being the moderator who asks the questions. So that's something that's very close to my heart. I said at the beginning that I'm currently working on. I mean, I've worked on climate change all my life, but I've been a nature lover all my life, and the two are not disconnected. And sometimes the solutions can feel like they're fighting each other. And we certainly have to find a way to get mutual leverage. But what I'm working on at the moment is carbon removals, on the basis that we're giving not enough but a certain amount of attention to adaptation. We're giving not enough but a certain amount of attention to reducing emissions. We've left it way too late to do that. We've long run out of runway, and now our only real fighting chance of getting down to net zero emissions quickly enough is also to do staggering amounts of removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. I was horrified and shocked when I discovered this, but the numbers really speak to that. So I mention that because when I tell people that I work on carbon removals, and maybe think about what your response might be, but what I hear a lot of is people either say, do you mean nature-based solutions? Do you mean trees? Or they say, do you mean technology? Do you mean machines? It's kind of nature versus tech. It's green versus chrome. And my personal campaign is to try to change that dichotomy because all of the solutions I've been finding to store carbon in trees, store it in soil, store it in the ocean, store it in rocks, store it in rocks underground, they all require some form of natural resources, something that you can really say is nature, is what the earth is offering to us. And they all require human ingenuity. Even planting trees, you've got to have satellite cover to make sure they stay there. You've got to have science to understand whether they're actually likely to burn and so on. So I'm saying that, and in the context of this kind of nature versus tech, it rhymes with that we live in cities and we don't know about nature, or we've disconnected ourselves and we're not in the Amazon. So I just wonder if you can comment a little bit, first of all, on the role that nature regeneration can play in providing that carbon removal service. And also on that, does it have to be nature or tech question?
Absolutely not. Yeah, I love the idea of nature and tech. My friend Kalpana is actually here. She said something to me a few weeks ago about the Wood Wide Web. And I was like, what? Yes. And it's this kind of concept around, like very solar punk, around how do we see the future, holding the knowledge of the past, like the indigenous people, like what we know, but then also holding the knowledge of the future, which is this technology, and seeing them work together. Yeah. I have a friend who's an academic, and she works on how do we use AI in order to spot logging in like different places and forests in Africa, but then also intertangling that with indigenous knowledge and practices from the indigenous groups that are preserving that land. And I think that is the future. I don't think it is everyone living caged, but I don't also think it is this weird dystopian carbon-free future. I think it's this middle ground of how do we use the old to influence the new and see, you know, the way that we work as an ecosystem in itself.
Brilliant. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I've been thinking quite a lot about the nature of problems, and there's a bit of sort of problem theory which talks about wicked problems, which is there's definitely no obvious solution, and so as soon as we're into binary, it's either this or it's that, then I think we've lost the plot. And we were joking earlier. I used the term called dichotomous keys. Which
Hang on, before you say anything else, hands up if you know what the term dichotomous key means. I didn't. Anyone?
No, well, this is
Anyone?
kind of in my training as an environmental scientist. If you want to find out what a spider is, you use a series of decisions. How many legs has it got? Has it got 6 or 8? And you follow I think it's kind of hardwired slightly into our training to make it it's either this or it's that, and if to get to a decision point. I guess I'm questioning whether those kind of dichotomies are helpful in finding the solution to wicked problems.
Sure, Tony, what do you think?
So on the question of whether nature-based solutions or technology is the answer, of course it's both, and it kind of depends where you are on the spectrum. Some of it is almost pure technology. So some of these carbon removal machines that are now being invented that are actually removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere mechanically, effectively, that's one end. At the other end, restoring a natural forest through natural regeneration is pure nature. And there's a lot of stuff in the middle. Yeah. But even the natural forest that's pure nature, you're still going to want to know how much carbon you've caught in order to be able to make the economics of it add up. And you're going to do that probably with a satellite or with some technology going over with a drone that's going to give you some measure of how much you've done.
And even the machines, by the way, have to put the carbon dioxide somewhere, which is usually into rocks.
Geological deposit, indeed. Probably the biggest thing that doesn't get talked about much is the potential for soil to take a lot of carbon. Given how much of the planet is in agriculture, this does deserve to be looked at more. We almost always go to trees. Increasingly, we've been talking about peatland, which is good, and that is a very important, it's a particular soil type, of course, But much of the planet is in agriculture, both in pasture and in cultivation. And the amount of carbon we could pack in there through different ways of farming, both with animals and also with crops, it's huge, absolutely huge. And again, you know, linking that to technology to be able to know how much you've got in there. So if you did create some incentive through a government policy to pay farmers for catching carbon, you're going to want some pretty high-tech approaches to understand how much you're catching. So it's a spectrum, of course, but the potential is absolutely enormous.
And this is something you could do on your land, right?
I was just going to say one other thing, which is we could spend an age thinking through the exact answers to these questions, but whisper it, we're out of time.
We're out of time. We are.
So we just need to get on and...
Someone just said, don't whisper it, shout it. I heard that from the audience. Shout it. We're out of time. We are.
That's Patrick in my team. He's always shouting about it.
Yeah, so absolutely. So that's another point about this. There's some fantastic soil approaches. Biochar is brilliant in giving longevity to carbon in soil. I found there's a couple of brilliant researchers and a company that's just set up, which are actually putting fungus back into soil. They're calling it rewilding the soil, because the fungus has been taken out. Put it back in, you actually increase the carbon, but the carbon stays there. And it also, by the way, channels nutrients symbiotically to the plants, and so everybody wins. So this is all brilliant, but I do think I love this point that Harry just made, which is that we can't actually afford to sit around and say, what's our perfect solution? Let's spend lots of time and energy and science actually working out exactly how it works. Having run out of time, we really need to throw everything we've got at this, and then be watching it and seeing and be very agile and almost entrepreneurial in our thinking. And before I go to the audience, my last question on this is, kind of dynamic, entrepreneurial, try it and see, really go for it, be in a hurry, isn't really the vibe and the reputation of I won't pick out any individual organisation, but most of the organisations that deal with nature in the UK, is it?
You're looking at me.
I'm not looking at anyone. I'm looking at the wall. No, but seriously.
Well, no, I think
it's the same question to Tony. It's the same question to Dave.
It's a great question, and what I would say is that the dynamism is part. I mean, I think the Trust is an incredibly dynamic place at the moment, but maybe I would say that. I think the dynamism is coming from the likes of Days and her contemporaries, and I also think some of the most inspirational stuff I've seen is private landowners.
Yeah.
I was at a place in Norfolk near my sister's house a couple of weeks ago where 4 private landowners had got together and just reimagined around a place called the Wendling Beck, reimagined what their land might look like, and it is inspirationally good.
Well, I'm going to challenge you in a way that you might actually like now rather than dislike, because when you said reimagined, you reminded me of that project you were talking about, where it's take away, get out of the way of all the things that are stopping the river, and allow it to reimagine itself, and then put in beavers and let nature do its thing. So I was teasing a little bit when I said that kind of dynamism isn't necessarily the reputation of organisations and charities that deal with nature, but there's an underlying energy and passion throughout those organisations. One of the questions really is, if we're looking to regenerate nature, how can we also give nature a chance to do what it's good at? How can we also regenerate that energy in all of these organisations and give them the chance to do what they're really good at, right?
I think a large part of this is learning how to surrender, and I think this is what the environmental movement, especially the activist end, knows how to do well. I stumbled into an Extinction Rebellion office when I was 19, and I said, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to coordinate a site, and they left me to do it. And that was this kind of like real surrendering of going, we've been trying this for a very long time, here's what we need to do. We need to hand over the baton to someone different, someone new, but then also give the support and wisdom to these like new thinkers who are dynamic, who do have solutions, but may just need a bit of like old knowledge to kind of like mold. And I think it's when we start to think about that on a larger scale, it's about how do we bring in communities who haven't been heard, who feel disconnected from nature, and then how do we bring them into making the solutions with us. I'm a big fan of the work that the Trust does and many other, whether it's the Crown's Trust, who's doing awesome work at the moment as well, and many other big landowners. But it's about how do we get the communities that are living near or on the land to buy into that process too.
Yeah.
It has to be everyone.
And the people visiting and everything. I'm going to hold on to that now. We'll come back just before the end, but we've got about 10, 15 minutes to ask questions. And so I think we've got a roving microphone, and straight away a hand actually went up here and one at the back. So let's take those two, one here and one at the back.
Thank you, and thank you for a fascinating talk. And it's brilliant to see that one of our largest landowners in the country is clearly so enlightened and driven by nature restoration. But I'm looking at that question on the screen: can the UK save nature? And surely, given the scale of what we're up against, all these wonderful anecdotes and philosophical approaches, surely we can only save nature through systemic intervention from government, because you've all talked about water. I mean, the reality is not one single river in this country meets its ecological standards. Last year, our water companies were allowed to discharge raw sewage into our rivers for 2.6 million hours. Yeah. The biggest polluter of our rivers, which is agriculture, is effectively allowed to do so. And iconic river catchments such as the River Wye, where there's now up to 30 million chickens being intensively farmed. This is a catchment that is all SAC and triple SR, in theory, the most protected rivers in Europe.
So is the question about business or about government or about both?
It's about government. I mean, it is a criminal offence to drive a car down a road at 150 miles an hour. Yet a farmer can spill slurry or digestate into a river.
Okay, so what do we think?
And get away with it. Because our environmental protection has effectively been defunded in this country. And surely the only way we can act, what was the phrase you used, we're out of time. The only way we can get there is by the emergency we're facing being given the same priority as a pandemic emergency or a Ukrainian emergency or a cost of living emergency.
Got it. I promise you, got it. Go.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. We need systemic change, and we need government to take it absolutely seriously. And you'll have seen, I hope, the National Trust voice and others really stepping into that over the last few months. What we do know, I think increasingly, is that we need 30% of the UK to be managed, land and sea, to be managed for nature. For nature to survive, and that's come out of. We're hoping that will be cemented in COP15 internationally. So the IPCC, as I understand it, has suggested that if nature wants to survive, we need 30% of the globe, land and sea, to be managed for nature. So the Trust owns 1.6% of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Clearly, that doesn't touch the sides of the challenge. So the simple answer to your question, do we need systemic change, is I would say yes.
I mean, I think in a way, and it was a brilliantly and passionately put question, I think there's also the point that we do actually have laws enshrined, we have systemic laws enshrined in the UK now around climate change, world-leading laws, the Climate Change Act, but we don't have anything like that's actually addressing the issues here. So what would it take to get nature and biodiversity to the same level that climate is here in the UK?
Well, I was director of Friends of the Earth when we launched the campaign for the Climate Change Act, which succeeded in 2008 with the first legislation in the world to do that. And the simple answer was public opinion. And the answer to your question is the same, because the politicians are always looking to see, what is the public kind of direction, what's the mood, where should we go with these discussions. And actually the campaign that National Trust, RSPB, Wildlife Trust ran a couple of months ago was a very good example of how that dynamic works between the policymakers determining their priorities and what the public say is, the direction of travel. And so the more that voice can get raised in a visible way that the politicians can see it, the better. And so depending on your preferences in terms of your tactical approaches, join either or both National Trust and Extinction Rebellion and make it clear that actually people do want this. Just on the legislation, just one controversial little subject. I know we're being streamed and this probably is something I shouldn't really go into, but there is legislation in Parliament at the moment to do away with all of the European laws by 2023. 85% of this country's environmental legislation is based upon European directives and regulations. And so the intent is, however, to do better than Europe, which I very much welcome, and ministers do want to do that. So all of us signalling that this is something that's desired by the population of the country is an important thing to do just at this moment when we have this transition from EU regimes into British regimes. And hopefully what we will have as a result of this change is world-beating legislation, literally, that will be even better than what Europe set out. And actually it will need to be if we're going to meet all these targets we've got now for nature recovery, for clean rivers, never mind climate change action.
Yeah, thank you. So the question at the back?
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to say a short thank you and then a question. So the short thank you comes from me. I'm Nick Stace. I'm the chair of the Conduit Holding Company, but also thoroughly committed tonight because I'm also a trustee of the National Trust. So I would say certainly join Extinction Rebellion, but also the National Trust and the Conduit, I think. But thank you very much. It's been a fantastic discussion. The question I've got, many years ago, actually in partnership with the National Trust, I set up something called the Wild Network, which was about trying to connect young people with the outdoors. And it was based on really staggering research that suggested that actually high security prisoners spent more time outside than young people in this country. I mean, that is extraordinary. So if you think about it in that way, then I just wanted, it was picking up on your statement at the end, actually, Days, when you talked about how do we connect local communities, how do we connect young people to nature. I just wanted some of your more practical ideas on how we might do that, because if we don't do that, then we really are in trouble.
Days?
Yeah, I think it's really important to allow young people to kind of have these opening into these bigger ideas. I think for me, that was the saving grace. I kind of grew up very disconnected to nature. I grew up in London for the most part. I grew up in poverty. So like I was playing out all of the social dynamics that affected my relationship with nature. But for me, what saved me was my financial situation changing and my mum becoming successful, sending us to boarding school. And then I'm like, oh my God, Lincolnshire's amazing, nature's beautiful. But a lot of people don't have that. And what we have to do is we have to start to think about how does politics play into this. And I liked your question earlier about it needs to be government up, but what we have to recognize is with democracy, it's literally demos kratos, it's people power, and we need people to basically say, you guys can't keep doing this. We need to address this problem like it's meant to be, and we need to start taking action in that way. And I think the more practical things, it's how do we make sure that you are the biggest annoyance to your local council, you are the biggest annoyance to your government, to make sure that young people have the space in their local area to be able to connect with nature. And that could be anything, whether it's your son or your daughter playing football in a park, or whether it's them learning how to go to a free forest school on a Friday. It has to be like at many different scales.
Thank you, Tony.
You just reminded me of one thing, Days, which sometimes I find myself presenting to groups of businesses and banks and various organisations, and people inevitably stick their hand up and say, what can I do? And there's all the obvious things about saving energy and switching vehicles and getting on your bike. The thing that I now say first is that this Saturday, instead of going shopping, take your children, grandchildren, nieces, neighbours' children to a nature reserve and see how many birds and plants you can identify. As a simple thing that pretty much most people can do.
Yeah.
And I think increasingly that's at the top of my list rather than turning the lights off, which was what I would have said 20 years ago.
Sure.
Just to build on that, I wouldn't take them to a nature reserve to ID birds, and because that ruined me. What I would say is engage them in a different way, along the likes of the Trust campaign about 50 things to do before you're 11 3/4, which invokes curiosity and exploration of nature, doesn't necessarily have to
the dichotomous key out.
Yeah, get the dichotomous key out.
We used to at home we used to have a nature table, and when we go out for a walk, we'd collect things and we'd go back and we'd try and figure out what they were. And so, there's a challenge, which is how many can you identify, but there's also it was like a treasure hunt. It's like I still can't, when I go past conkers, I collect them and I go home and I go, now what am I going to do with it? Yes.
So just start by saying my grandson goes to a state-run forest school in Muswell Hill, and it's brilliant.
Excellent.
I think every child should go to forest school. My question is about land tenure. Over the last 40 years, there have been really substantial changes in the ownership of land in this country. One of the drivers of it was privatization of the water companies. and the water companies have a huge impact on nature and the environment. There's one really interesting thing, which is that the Welsh water is owned by bondholders, whereas all the other water companies are owned by shareholders. Is there any evidence that the ownership structure of Welsh water is better than the privatised companies in the rest in England? And if so, can the Welsh teach us that, and we can then teach them football?
Oh!
I might answer that, and I'm sorry to say I don't think it does. Or I wouldn't pinpoint that as the point of difference between the water companies. I think it's about philosophy, approach, leadership, how they view their business model, etc., etc. I don't think it's just about land tenure.
It's a good idea, though. I am actually half English and quarter Welsh, and so I was kind of 2-1 pleased last night, I guess. More questions? Okay.
Thanks very much. Can I just underline the rather negative point about the retained EU law bill? It is just as bad as advertised, I'm afraid. It's at least 570 environmental laws are up for revocation or reform, plus another 1,400 laws which they found in the National Archives very recently. And they're all due to be reformed. So we have the curious situation that Therese Coffey may be going to COP15 and talking about saving nature at a time when she's considering revoking the substance of the Habitats Directive. It doesn't make much sense. So I'd just like to make that point. And then perhaps on a more positive note, I'm very interested to see what you said, Dace, about engagement of young people with this idea of saving nature, and interested in the question before and how it would be made most effective. Some of the climate activists I'm working with, they do amazing things at COP27 and then go back on school visits and sort of planting mangroves, and so it's a mixture of practical and highfalutin, which I guess you do too.
Sure. Any other questions, comments? One here.
Hi, I've agreed with many of the points that you've made, and I'm just interested in this framing of the way that we have of talking about nature, so as nature is somewhere out there, and how do we connect children with nature? And but we can start with what we have. Nature is our bodies. We are nature. So if we start there, we don't need to go. It's a very good place to start. It's just where we are and connecting with and that is a very, very deep aspect of Western philosophy, is the way in which we make the mind-body distinction, and no, we are only our minds and we are not our bodies, but no, we are our bodies. So maybe that is a really good place to start with a lot of these challenges, is this recognition that we are already nature because we are already our bodies, and starting a lot of those campaigns around that.
Sure, thank you. So we can go to the Amazon and see it, and then we can sort of do it here in the UK, and then we can go to a nature reserve, and then we can go to the National Trust, and then we can go to our own bodies. Before we comment on that, because I sort of want to finish with it, we're in the last few minutes, I just want to do a very quick kind of almost popcorn. We asked you at the beginning, what's your relationship with nature? So I just wonder, this is going to be a bit of a challenge for whoever has the microphone, but can we just have some very quick responses? What did you say? What's your relationship with nature? So I'd like to finish up on that. So anyone, what was your relationship on nature? If you put your hand up, the mic will come to you. So very quick, very quick.
I run a campaigning organisation against river pollution.
So what's your relationship? What's your relationship with nature?
I grew up on the banks of a river, and I spent a lot of time in and around rivers. Yeah.
So you feel connected to rivers? You grew up on them. Someone else?
It's my energy source.
It's your energy source. That's a good one. What else? Who else? Can we have a microphone back there as well, so we can spread it around a bit? Back at the back.
It's my safe space.
It's your safe space. It gives you energy. It's your safe space. What's yours?
Deep and abiding.
Deep
and abiding, sorry.
Deep and abiding relationship. That's a good one. Who else? Anyone else? Come on.
I do a lot of spearfishing, so I get a lot of my food from the sea. So it's a
get your
source.
food, a source of food, yeah. Anyone else? Where's the other microphone? I can't see it now. We've got one at the back somewhere. Anyone else back there? Just very quickly. Kim,
I think it's really interesting what my old friend said about your body, but I think I question how much people are connected to their body and nature. And nature to me is I feel alive when I'm in nature.
Yeah.
I spend most of my time working at a desk. But I wonder how much people need released to feel that, you know, and it's okay saying you take people to nature, but do they need more? Do they need some awareness raising? Do they need to be pointed out, or does it come naturally?
Yeah, and that's also a good question, but it's how to release this safe space, energy source. I feel alive. I feel like I get my food from it. I get my leisure from it. I get my sense of safety from it. So in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to come back to the panelists. I was resisting asking this all the way through, although I was dying to ask. So now that we're at the end of this conversation, what did you say at the beginning? What's your relationship with nature, Tony?
My relationship with nature, complicated, and it's changed over time. One thing that's not changed is an absolute obsession with nature. As a small kid, I was birds, fish, reptiles, rivers, clouds. I was just obsessed with it all. And then that led to understanding that much of it was in decline, which then led to an interest in conservation, which brings me to where I am today. And I spent a lot of time, much more in the extinction rebellion kind of domain, working at Friends of the Earth for 18 years and with WWF. I've written books, I've kind of made the case for nature. And the place I'm in now is trying to build partnerships to do something about the catastrophe which is unfolding.
I understand that that's what you're doing, and it's the final thing I wanted to ask you. We had people say things like energy source, safe
It's
space.
all of it, multiple. It's multiple. It's everything that I am anyway.
It's everything that you are.
Yeah, literally, in terms of the body piece, which is much easier to visit than a nature reserve, isn't it? So we can all relate to that.
Harry.
Yeah, it's kind of elemental for me. I was brought up in a really dull suburban part of Norwich, and the only thing which made it great is that my little garden backed onto a wood, and I just spent my life there with my mates, and that was the kind of formative thing in terms of what I wanted to do. I think what it means now for me, it's changed, and I'm more worried about it now, just because of I think the nature of my work and the threat it's under. For me now, it's about my health, actually, physical, mental, everything. If I don't get out into it, so I was overnight in London, I had to get out by the river today for a run this morning, and it's a part sort of cleansing thing, but it's actually just
Cleansing as well,
I will get ill mentally and physically if I don't do it.
So it's a health source mentally and physically.
Yeah,
Days.
and I really love the notion of like connecting to our bodies, because that's so important. I think we've talked about all the scales we can connect to nature, and the body is the first beginnings. And I talk about the inner work, and the inner work happens in the mind, but it also happens in the body as well. I came to this from health issues, actually. I found out about the climate crisis because I was dealing with air pollution where I was living, and this kind of connects me back to why I end up loving nature so much. Because
But when you told me that story, because when you went to Norwich, and you told me about encountering nature for the first time, how did it make you feel?
It made me feel safe. I grew up in poverty. I grew up in a domestically violent home. And I didn't feel safe for a very long time, but going out into nature and then finding that safety and that constant, and the fact that, we are in a climate crisis, hence why it made me very ill very quickly and very scared. But what I recognize is that, weirdly enough, I know this sounds really weird, but like, nature's going to be pretty fine. At this point, we're helping ourselves. We're trying to stop ourselves hurting ourselves. And we need to kind of reframe the way that we look at this question, in fact.
Just one other thing, if I may, for me.
We're running over, I'm going to go in trouble. But
there's something about it just takes you out of your everyday, and whether that's a bit of birds, a blackbird singing, or it's watching ants carrying crisps, as I was a couple of weeks ago, just extraordinary. It is extraordinary.
I love that. That's a very urban example.
It grounds you, doesn't it? It grounds you.
Yeah. So I've got a suggestion for a closing chant, if I may, just to round this off. And it's
no, you can't, because I've got a closing off as well.
Oh, okay,
so
well, let me do it as a pre-closing chant then. The lady's point here about being connected to nature through our bodies. I used to lecture, well, I still do, in Cambridge, and there was a fellow who used to come across from Michigan State University, and he would talk about some of these subjects, and he would start by inviting the students to shout out, "I am an animal." Right? Can we please? I am an animal. I am an animal.
Speak for yourself, mate.
And after a little bit of that, you realise that actually you're no different to everything else that's going on out there.
Excellent. I cheekily threw in a speak for yourself, mate, but okay, I am an animal too. All right, so we slightly went over, but it was too much fun to stop. So I'm going to give a very quick summary, and then I'm going to tell you my relationship with nature, because I made everyone else do it too. So first of all, some of the things that I heard about the importance of partnerships, getting to scale. This phrase that we had, it's total war. And this speaks to your question as well. It's like, you know, we can have a nice conversation here at the Conduit, and we can sort of say, well, you should be nice to people, and you should do this, and that's all, and that's not getting us where we need to go. And so it should be total war on all fronts. And I hope we can give some of you tonight the energy to go away and to be doing that wherever you can to raise this energy up. This beautiful image that you gave us, Harry, of allowing a river to reimagine itself and find its own way. Allowing a river to reimagine itself and find its own way. And in a way, we sort of need to reimagine ourselves so we can find our own way as well. This brilliant stuff about the Nature Recovery Network, how you can go from kind of a top-down but stick it all together locally and then have the pressure from campaigning as well. We heard about that as being important. Dave's saying she was a big fan of trespassing. I'm not really sure where to go with that, but I definitely thought we should mention it again. Then this thing about the strange alliances I thought was really important. And then this thing that you said, Days, which is going to lead me to, we talked about nature and tech, and we also talked about how it's not the old versus the new. It's not even the old versus the young any more than it's green versus tech. We actually have to find the leverage in all of that to be able to solve this. And this point about learning how to surrender, I think is going to be very important in all of this space. But what you said, Daisy, is you said climate and environment are a route for people to know who they are and who they need to be in the world. Climate and environment are a route for people to know who they are and who they need to be in the world. It's a beautiful way of putting it, and it brings me to the final bit, which is my relationship with nature. So apparently at age 3, at a picnic in the Lake District, everyone was getting the stuff out of the car, and somebody said, "Where's Gabriel?" And eventually they found me, my little legs pumping. I'd run down the hill up the other side, and I was trying to get into the woods before they could get to me and stop me, and that's kind of been my attitude to nature ever since. My mum is convinced I must have a guardian angel because of all the points I've had. But it's all of those things. It's safe space, it's energy source, it's grounding, it's health. I have to go out. I live in London, but I have to go out into nature every day. I live near Regent's Park and Primrose Hill, and every day, early morning, I'm out there because I have to be. But you mentioned blackbird singing, and I just want to finish on this one thing, because in the is it nature or a city point, there was one year, a few years ago, where I heard the first blackbird of spring. It's always a very special moment for me when I hear the first blackbird of spring. And I was in Camden Town. It was in an urban street. There was maybe 1 or 2 trees, but nothing much else. And I was looking around trying to hear it. Where is it? Where is it? I can hear it. I stopped. I screeched to a halt. And as I was looking, I noticed there was another man standing there going, he said, "I think it's up there." And then we both stood there for a few minutes in the middle of the city, and we listened to the blackbird singing the first blackbird of spring. And then he nodded and said, "Beautiful, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And we walked on our way. And in the end, I think that's fundamentally what we need. We are nature. We are in among nature. Nature's finding a way to adapt to us. We need to find a way to adapt to nature. And my last comment is sort of yours. The question is, can the UK save nature? And I think the question should really be, can nature save the UK? Are we going to give nature the space to save the UK? And I hope we will. Thanks very much.